So I'd like to start talking today about breeding parrots. I've been an aviculturist for 50 years. I've seen most of the parrot species in the field and in my various roles, whether it was curator, whether consultant, or in my own private collection. I think I can safely say that I have bred more species than anyone else alive today. Next. So aviculture started obviously many centuries ago. In fact, when Columbus reached the Caribbean, he found that they kept Bahamian and Cuban Amazons as pets. There are records that even predate that from Mexico, suggesting that they were actively breeding macaws for the feathers, which were used in indigenous art. But aviculture, as we know it today, really started in the 1970s. And that's when surgical sexing was first introduced. Why was surgical sexing so important? Because really, prior to that, it was guesswork. People often thought, oh, these two birds paired off, they got along very well. That means nothing. Two males can pretend to be a pair, they can mate. Two females can do the same. It was surgical sexing in 1975 that allowed us to visualize, to see the sexual organs, and not only determine the gender, but also the health condition of those birds. Next. Since the 1975, the introduction of surgical sexing, more parrot species have been bred than in the previous 200 years. Next. So many species were bred that, in fact, most of the breeding records, if you align them, fall in that period that goes from about 1978 to about 1990. It includes many species that are actually, unfortunately, unknown in the US. Eisman's conure, diademid Amazons, Marajo Island Amazons, yellow-shouldered Amazons, maroon-fronted parrots, blue-headed and blue-throated macaws. Next. This improved knowledge actually changed the focus then to how do we provide a proper nest and what do we feed these birds? We realized very quickly that the standard box that the British had invented, and aviculture, as was practiced in the US until that time, emulated the UK method. A square or grandfather type nest, a long aviary with solid sides, a seed diet, bread and milk when they were rearing young, some greens and some apple. Clearly that was not enough. At around the same time as surgical sexing entered the picture, a vet by the name of Theodore J. Lefevre realized that most of the birds that were entering aviculture were dying from dietary issues. There were deficiencies that were the main killer. And that's where the initiation of the pellet food concept started. Next. It also saw the introduction of many new species, saffron-headed parrots on the right, tepui parrotlets on the left. These birds could not have been kept alive prior to that time frame. They have been kept alive and bred post that time frame. Next. The newfound abilities to advance aviculture even saw the establishment of many spectacular mutations. You know, the US, since the passing of the Wild Bird Conservation Act in 1992, has really seen a degradation of aviculture. Europe still imports many species. You're allowed to import a small group for breeding. The US, we can do that, but the hurdles are insurmountable. You need to establish a consortium. It's very difficult. The Europeans have been able to import birds, and they've now established some really spectacular mutations. So next. In 50 years, I have learned that parrots are complex creatures, and their breeding biology is really poorly understood. Breeding birds is not a cage, a nest, food, and waiting. It requires a lot more. You really need to understand the birds. Next. We know that divorce is common, even in long-term proven pairs. When they're given the opportunity, they will change partners. That debunks the concept that we often see the AR claim that parrots mate for life, and that when one dies, the other partner, the surviving partner, withers away and also dies. Next. And that one diet for all species is not valid. Many species have very specific dietary requirements, and those dietary requirements need to be understood. Next. We understand that the need for protein exists in some species, particularly some of the black cockatoos, gang, and yellowtails, for example, and that most parrots avoid ripe fruits. They don't want to compete with fruit bats and many other frugivorous mammals. So what do? They avoid sweet fruits. They eat them green. And that has developed birds that are really not adapted to eating all of this apple and all of this green, very ripe, sweet fruit that we have available in our supermarkets. In fact, I was in the area of Siberia some years ago, and there was a wild apple tree growing, and I made the stupid mistake of popping a piece of fruit in my mouth. It was bitter, astringent, it was horrible. Nothing whatsoever related to the sweet apples that we buy in the supermarkets. Next. And that we need to understand that fat birds will not breed. Diet is very important. And what we feed the birds is equally important. Next. We know that obesity is a major cause of infertility in Amazon parrots, for example. Next. That high beta-carotene diets are a key to the success of keeping Eclectus and some other Asiatic parrots alive. That, by the way, is Rydell's eclectus. It is one of the rarest subspecies. Females are all red. So sorry, that's not Rydell's, that's Cornelius. I just looked at the tail. There's two solid red eclectus, Rydell's and Cornelius. Rydell's have a yellow band at the end of the tail in the females. Next. We also know that diet can influence gender. Diets that are very rich in protein and fat produce more males. Diets that are lower in protein and fat produce more females. Next. And that, the diets that evolved originally, seed diets, really not good. People often tell me, well, I'll sprout. Culture your sprouts and you will be shocked at what grows there. There is this current trend of feeding chop, which is an amorphous mush of fruits and vegetables. Look, parrots have zygopodactylous feet, 2 toes forward, 2 toes backward. That's intended to grab something to eat. They don't eat like dogs that swallow everything that's on their plate. They've developed that foot and that tongue to gyrate fruits. Chop is not good for them. It destroys one of the principal habits that have evolved, which is for the bird to grasp the fruit, to be able, or the vegetable, and to be able to eat what is there. Secondly, people say that pelleted diets, which I am a proponent of, are unnatural. Well, you know what? So are pansy flowers. So is sunflower seeds. So is wheat. None of these elements that we feed these birds occur naturally in the wild. So all diets are unnatural. We just need to find something that provides their nutritious needs and that feeds not only the body, but also the mind. Next. We know that, as I stated, the diet can skew one gender or the other. And this is important because in some species that you look at, cockatoos, for example, it is males that become very aggressive and most of the animals handed over to rescues. If we could produce more females, there is historical data that suggests they become better pets, they're less prone to become hormonal, and therefore they're less prone to being turned into a rescue as unwanted. Next. We know that foods rich in sugar are not good. People ask me, what do I feed my birds? I feed vegetables. I feed beta carotene rich vegetables. I feed sweet potato and pumpkin and cauliflower and broccoli. I feed them vegetables. I feed very little fruit. And when I do, I try to feed tropical fruit, guava, mango, and I don't feed it ripe. Sugar is not good for them. They've not evolved for it, and they avoid sweet, ripe fruits in nature. Next. We know that when you feed these bananas and apples and grapes and all of these things in cockatoos, it increases aggression. It agitates the birds, and they are then more prone to kill their mates. Next. And mate aggression is a huge problem in some cockatoos, in some other species, but particularly cockatoos. You also see it in hawk-headed parrots and in Amazons. But mate aggression is a main killer of even established long breeding pairs of cockatoos. Let's reduce all of the risks of enhancing or heightening that aggression. And one of those steps that we can take is reduce sweet fruits from their diet. Next. Here, I mentioned hawkheads and Amazons, two birds that were killed by their mates. And you know what? Both birds have been fed lots of fruits because somebody in the internet said, these birds need a lot of fruits. Look, in this modern day, everybody turns to the internet, and everybody is a self-professed expert on the internet. Question the sources. How many birds have they bred? How long have they been in aviculture? What is their field experience? I could come up with dozens of so-called experts that have no real experience. Having one or two birds or breeding a couple of species is nothing. It teaches you nothing. In fact, after 50 years, I could say each day the birds prove me wrong and they teach me something new. Question the source of the information. If someone tells you to feed them apple and banana and grapes because this is all great, or sprouted seeds, question. Test your sprouted seeds. See if you grow any bacteria. Question the source, question the information, and examine what you feed your birds. Next. We can take many steps to reduce aggression. One of them is to clip the wings on the aggressor. We can employ special nest boxes, and we can reduce sweet fruits. Next. Building the proper cage also reduces the probability of mate aggression. We know that male cockatoos get very agitated very easily, and that the females need to get away to reduce that aggression. What these suspended panels do is they allow the female to fly away and to hide from a male that is aggressive. Remember, the male would have a clipped wing, so he wouldn't be able to fly. He would have to climb to her. But if there is no barriers, if climbing is very easy, then he can tire her out and move in for the kill. And by the way, this behavior of mate killing is not just confined to captivity. It also occurs in the wild. Next. You can even employ rotational cages. This design was invented by Susan Clubb, and it's for eclectus. Eclectus females are dominant. Males are submissive. Females can get very aggressive. Well, what this allows is for the males to rotate around and approach females that are receptive, and to get away from females that are not receptive. Remember, in parrots, there are 3 methods of bonding: strong bonded, macaws, conures, Amazons. That's why the 2 birds of the same sex will mate, will pair, and will behave like a pair. Then you have non-bonded birds, eclectus, ringneck parakeets, other Asiatic parakeets. And you've got some intermediate birds that will tolerate the females, or tolerate the males, but do not show the outward aggression that the non-bonded birds do. And those intermediate birds are Pyonis parrots, for example. Next. You make sure that you use for the aggressive species a T-shaped nest. That nest has a divider in the middle, and the concept behind it is that a male that is intent on killing the female will not be able to pin her inside the nest, but that she will be able to get away, because obviously they become quite agitated and they start to scream and their eyes become glossy. Understanding bird behavior is very, very important. In 1979, I was a novice aviculturist. I was 19 years old and I wanted to breed Amazon parrots. I went to meet and spend some time with Ramon Nogel. Ramon Nogel was an American Amazon parrot breeder that worked out of Sefna. He was a Kardecian spiritualist priest. He would have seances. I come from a family that's very open-minded, but when I arrived at Ramon's place, he said, "We're going to church tonight." You know, I was brought up under a very religious, in a very religious home. But his concept of religion was very different. It was seances and talking to the dead. I went to his house that night, and obviously there were no cell phones. There were wall phones, and I called my grandfather, who was a great, great mentor in my life. And I said, "Listen, can you book me a ticket? I want to go home. This is crazy." And he said, "Stick it out. Let's see what you learn." And the next day, Ramon says, "You know, you need to listen to the birds. They talk to you. They talk to you very clearly. Listen and you will succeed." And I went back and I said, "Man, this was a weird trip." And my grandfather said, "I think you're being too literal. Maybe what he means is that they teach you with their behavior." And in the following decades, I realized that he was right. Their behavior teaches us a lot. So when you see a male cockatoo pacing the bottom of the cage, screaming, agitated, bouncing, glassy eyes, he's going to become murderous. Keep an eye on him. If necessary, pull him out of the cage. You never pull out the female. You always pull out the male. Why? Because that you want her to maintain that territory. When it comes time to reintroduce them, you don't want to introduce a female into his territory. You want to introduce a male into her territory that she controls and that she understands. Next. As I said, the original concept of a nest box was this, the grandfather type, a square or rectangular box. We know that that is antiquated, that many boxes can bring about results. Next. Many species utilize nest boxes with specific entrances. This was in South America, and the severe macaws always like a side entrance with like a funnel. Next. And people often tell me, "Oh, metal nest boxes, they won't use them." Well, guess what? This is a wild Amazon parrot that was given this nest, and it readily accepted a metal nest. It's not the color of the nest or the makeup. It is the shape of the nest that is important. Next. Plastic nest, metal nest, wooden nest, they're all acceptable. Next. But what's important is the shape. I was probably the first person to have St. Thomas conures in the US. And when we studied them in nature, because I wanted to breed them, I realized that like all conures, they nest in termite mounds, and they tunnel, they dig a hole at the bottom, they tunnel up, and then they tunnel back down into a nesting chamber. Well, the birds refused to use it as a standard nest. I duplicated it. I took a nest that they go in from the bottom, they have to literally go up and then come back down. And what I do is that top is removable. I fill it up with cork. The cork duplicates the termite mounds, and this type of nest is now being used widely across the world for some of these conures that are resistant to nesting. And that includes blue crowns and mitrids and many other conures that have proven difficult to nest. This is but one type. I'll show you a second type of nest in a second. Next. When we look at the birds, and I said that we listen to them, they teach us. This particular scarlet macaw kept laying eggs in the corner of a cage. She was telling me, listen, I don't like the nest boxes you're giving me. I want a nest in an open box. So I had these boxes for my chickens. I put it in there and she immediately nested. Next. Then when I mentioned that some conures require a second type of nest, this is it. It's basically a nest with an entrance on the bottom. It duplicates that same zigzag where they go up, around, and down. And that's what that nest looks like on the inside. You basically fill it up with pieces of cork that you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's. You glue them together using Elmer's glue. You create a solid block. The birds tunnel, they chew, and they nest. This is particularly good for blue crowns and Mexican green conures. Next. A different version of a U-shaped nest for cockatoos. Next. A nest for African grays with an entrance, and this duplicates what I saw in West Africa. The pair selected a nest where the male could sit at the entrance looking out while the female incubated. This type of nest is widely used in the country that produces more African grays than everybody in the world together, South Africa. Next. And then for egg breakers, you need to make it a challenge. They can't just look down into the nest and see the female. You need to block the visuals. Why do birds break eggs? One, because they're maladapted. They were hand-reared, made into pets. They don't really know how to behave like birds, or simply because they want to mate. They chase the female out, break the eggs, she's got to cycle again. So what you do is you just create baffles so that the male looks in and can't see the female at the bottom of the nest. This is one type of nest. This is very good for conures, blue-throated conures, for example, that are notorious for egg breaking. Also, narrow and deep boxes. This type of box also works well for galahs or rose-breasted cockatoos, another species that is notorious for egg breaking. Next. If the standard nest with the baffles doesn't work, this is an adaptation for a nest where the egg literally rolls out of control and the birds can't get it, and you can remove the egg for artificial incubation. Next. For Brotogeras, another termite nesting species, what we do is we literally have a long box. You create sections with cork, so they have to dig through, then they have to find a way to get to the next chamber and then to the next chamber. Darkness and this activity induces the gonads and it encourages breeding. Next. Why do we use cork or pieces of wood? Because in the wild, birds do not find a pre-made nest with pine shavings. They find a cavity that's been opened by woodpeckers or by rot or a fallen branch, and then they've got to prepare it. And that preparation changes the direction of their attention from the male wanting to mate and possibly killing the female to saying, I've got to make a nest. I've got to help her prepare it, because if she doesn't, she's not going to breed and we're not going to be able to have sex. So what we do is we fill the nest up with chunks of wood and let them chew. We know that the darkness induces ovulation and testicular development, and it also encourages breeding. Next. And you make nest inspection part of your daily routine. People tell me, oh, when I open the nest, they break eggs. Why are they breaking eggs? Because suddenly you're intruding. You should make it part of your daily inspection, even when they're not nesting. And then outside the breeding season, if you can, pair the birds together. They often change partners. They don't mate for life like many people believe. Work done by Chris Rowley in Australia and rose-breasted cockatoos showed that they divorced commonly. Subsequent work in other parts of Australia and in Florida on feral macaws shows that, hey, they switch partners all the time. Give them an opportunity if they don't breed. If you have 3 pairs of birds that after the 3rd year have not nested, put them all together. Let's see if they switch partners. Even when they breed, if they stop breeding, do the same thing. Encourage them to find new partners. This invigorates them and stimulates them to breed. Next. Here, these were proven pairs that suddenly decided, hey, we don't like our old partners. Next. Hand rearing as we know it today really evolved in the 1960s. Prior to that, there are reports in the Archive of Indies in Seville dating to the era of discovery, where they reported that Indians would chew roots and plants and feed baby parrots from their mouth. But as we know it today, aviculture started hand rearing in the 1960s, and formulas have changed a lot since then. For example, if you look at Velma Hart, who was an early aviculturist, she would add a couple drops of cognac to the formula. And this isn't something that somebody told me. I was fortunate enough to meet Velma Hart. And she just said, look, it makes the babies more comfortable. Obviously, we don't add liquor anymore, but we understand that their nutritional needs are very important and that you should, rather than mixing a hodgepodge of ingredients, always try to get a pre-formulated formula. Pellets and formulas are all based on poultry research. Very little research has been done on the requirements of parrots, but empirical day-to-day use has shown that they work. And for those of you that say there's a lot of research to feeding sprouted seeds or this hodgepodge mush that they call chop, there isn't any. It's empirical. It's all somebody feeding it, the birds ate it, and now it becomes the new wonder elixir. Next. Hand rearing is an important tool because it allows increased production. I'll give you an idea. In one of the collections that I consult, when a red-tailed black cockatoo is allowed to rear its chick, it's a 2-year process. When the eggs are taken, they can produce 8 chicks a year. Why is this important? If you're dealing with an endangered species, you need to produce as many individuals as possible to try to increase their numbers. Even when you are working with a mutation, the same, you need numbers to be able to try to establish that mutant. Next. You need to identify the hand feeding tool, and there are countless. I like this syringe with a spoon because it stops the crop being punctured or aspiration that often happens when a person uses a silicone catheter or a stainless steel tube. Macaws pump hard, and people, if you don't have a grasp for that beak, you can puncture that crop wall. I get messages weekly during the breeding season. My bird has developed a hematoma. It's got a hard ball. You've punctured the crop. Next. Learn proper formula preparation. Read instructions. Some formulas become a lump that you could use as wallpaper glue. Understand the instructions. Always heat the water and then add formula. No formula tells you to add it to cold water and then heat it, and the amount of time that you heat it, how long it should be heated for. That needs to be described in the instructions. You may need to cook some of the carbohydrates in the formula, or they become a gel. And how do you cook it? By warming up that water, adding the formula, agitating it until it cools down, and then feeding it. Next. Use an electronic thermometer. Look, we are in the 21st century. Science is all around us. I still see people putting formula on the back of their wrist. When I was a kid, my dad owned a restaurant, and he had a cook that would fry food, and he would stick his hands in the fat. He had a huge tolerance for heat. Imagine sticking your finger in that formula and saying, oh, it's fine, and then burning the crop of the babies. People, it occurs weekly. I get messages constantly of this is happening. not only is it a very painful situation, many of the chicks sadly do not survive. Get a good electronic thermometer, agitate the food and take a reading so that you get a reading of the entire formula. Next. And understand the need for fat. Here are two kikes, one fed 21, one fed 10% fat. Hatched the same day, same parents, the eggs were artificially incubated. The eggs were held until there was a clutch, and then they were incubated together. This teaches you that fat is very important, even in species like cockatoos that don't have a fat requirement as they get old, or Amazons that are prone to obesity. When they're young, they coordinate nesting with the fruiting of certain trees that produce high fat foods. Next. And understand that chunky formula are very important for palm cockatoos, hyacinth macaws, and golden conures. I recently had someone in Switzerland reach out to me because they had lost, I don't know how many palm cockatoo babies. And I said, starting at day 6, add chopped up nuts and chopped up broccoli to the formula. Oh, they'll die. No, they won't. You know what? He's rearing the baby successfully. These species, I've seen them in the wild. I've climbed trees. The parents literally stuff whole foods down their crops, and they're digesting it. They've evolved for this chunky food rather than this fine, smooth formula that is what most people feed. You use regular formula, you use chunkiness to it. Next. And here it is. There's a baby palm cockatoo, and that's the chunky bits of ground up macadamia nut. You can see some pieces of broccoli there. Unfortunately, I was taking the picture and feeding the palm cockatoo chick at the same time. So most of the chunkiness had already gone into the crop. Next. I like to feed chicks the minute they hatch. This nonsense of giving them lactated ringers for 24 hours because this is good for them. I've climbed enough trees to tell you that. The parents feed them the minute they hatch. I've seen Amazon chicks that were still wet from hatching that had already food in their crop. We feed them the minute they hatch. We don't wait 24 hours and during this process give them fluids. We feed immediately on finding them. Next. We keep the crop full all day. It's only allowed to empty at night. This is what happens in nature. When people tell me, oh, I've got to let the crop empty or I have health issues, then you've got a husbandry problem, not a diet problem. Next. The best way to deal with a slow crop is this papaya. You basically take ripe papaya and seeds, you grind it up with a little Pedialyte, and you feed this until the crop begins to move. Once the crop moves, you then start blending in some formula. And I learned this going camping in Cape York in Northern Australia to look at palm cockatoos. And when we stopped along the way, they were buying an ungodly amount of meat. We would not be able to have ice for the length of the trip. And I kept saying, this meat is going to decompose. And what they did is they wrapped it up in papaya seeds. And lo and behold, the meat lasted far longer than did the ice. So I said, you know what, I'm going to try this on chicks. And now this papaya cream is widely used across the world. Next. Treat each brooder as a separate unit. We use different cups. We add the formula to that, and then we feed. Next. Mark your chicks to identify, to permit monitoring their weights or any issues that you may see. You can use gentian violet that you can buy a small bottle for next to nothing at Walmart. You can use markers. You can use lots of things to mark them with. I am not in favor of using tie racks. I've seen many chicks lose a leg because a tie rack tightened around the foot, and the breeder did not realize this. Next. Keep chicks warm. Chilling is a major problem in slowed crops. Next. Keep them dark. I have enough weights over 50 years to show that when chicks are kept in bright light, their growth is impacted. When they're kept dark, they sleep longer, digest better, and are less agitated. Remember, they would be in a dark cavity until they're ready to feather out. Next. Weigh them regularly, establish baseline data for your collection. I have data that goes back 50 years of most of the species that we still breed. And whenever there's a doubt, I have averages of many chicks. I look at the average and say, okay, this chick is growing normal, or this chick requires some extra attention. In my books, I try to give a lot of references on weights because of that. And I try to also point out when the eyes open, when the feathers first come in, because if there's deviation from this, there may be stunting. Next. Observe, observe, and observe. We started hand rearing kikes from day one because we wanted to increase our production. And, like most people, I have workers that help me, and it cost me 120 grand a year to maintain my farms. That's excluding food. So obviously we needed to make money, and we were breeding more chicks to cover this. We only breed a certain amount of chicks that we know we can give them the proper care, but I don't want to make money from my birds. I need to cover my expenses. So kikes were in great demand, and we wanted to increase production, but we found that we were losing them constantly. Well, being the typical anal Virgo that I am, I installed cameras in the nursery. And they showed me that the chicks were aspirating after we were feeding them. They would get agitated, fall on their backs, and aspirate. I decided that I would keep them in small cups, penguin style, for a few days, and then the problems resolved. Why? Because they couldn't flip on their backs and aspirate. Next. Deal with problems quickly. This thing of, oh, I can wait, I'll wait till tomorrow, let me think about it. The problem will not go away. I have a real issue with antibiotics. Some people kill them. They overuse them. They don't have any science behind them. But I also have issues with people that have the science and say, well, I'm not really in favor of using antibiotics. I am currently working on some phages. Phages are bacteria that eat, are viruses that eat bacteria that you would add to the food. I hope to have the study finished by the time the Cockatoo book is completed, so I can include that. And if not, I will obviously be doing videos and articles on it. So you deal with problems as they come along. You don't wait if the chick has got yeast or if it's got a bacterial problem. Culture, work with a vet. I have 50 years of experience, and I still work very closely with vets. In fact, at every consulting job that I have ever done, one of the requisites is that I have a vet on staff that works with me. Next. When chicks hatch with an open umbilical or unabsorbed yolk, the general concept is you add betadine. I found that simple white sugar, cane sugar, works far better. You literally apply it to the area, and you use dental floss to tie but not sever the protruding yolk. The sugar dries it, it inhibits bacterial growth, and it resolves the problem. Usually when you have an unretracted egg yolk, there are issues with an incubator. People tell me, oh, but the digital reading, and here's what I meant by tying it. But the digital reader on the incubator tells me the temperature is right. Incubators need to be calibrated. We calibrate ours every year, and we use calibrated thermometers that are the same that NASA uses. They're very expensive, but I don't want to kill a chick. I don't want my negligence because I didn't have a calibrated thermometer to check the incubator be the cause of death. Next. That was the same chick, by the way, 7 days later. You can still see vestiges there of the dental floss that was used to tie, but not sever the protruding yolk. Next. When legs are splayed, I don't like to necessarily tie them. I like to use a sponge because the sponge provides some body support and doesn't have the chick sit in awkward positions. We need to provide these babies with the best care and the best attention that's within our realm. Next. When there is a malocclusion, the top beak goes into the bottom one. It's very common in palm cockatoos that are artificially incubated. You can either next glue a tip of a straw to the upper beak and glue it with crazy glue. That's the chick on the left is the same chick as you're seeing on the far right, Moluccan cockatoos, or you can do the following next. Oh, sorry, I don't have the video, the image there. You can basically tie the beak shut using duct tape at night. And you place it in proper shape, and then you just tie the beak together so that the upper mandible can't go into the lower mandible. Next, malocclusion in macaws is quite common. This happens as a result of feeding from only one side, or the chick going hungry, not getting enough food, not having enough fat. It grabs the side of the container and begins to pump as it does as the beaks deviate. Next. Solutions are a very deep tub. In this case, these are garbage cans. Next. And aligning, sorry, I thought I had the image there, aligning the beaks when you feed or feeding from alternate sides. Toe restricting syndrome or constricting syndrome, you see it there. It's quite common in Amazons and macaws. It seems to be you also see it in African parrots. It seems to be related to a lack of proper humidity. When it happens, you have to cut the ring or it will strangulate the toe and you will lose it. Next. When there's yeast, you can tell in the mouth. You can generally smell the Clostridium or the yeast in the mouth. You can prophylactically get a gallon of water and add some gentian violet as a dye. It is not a medication. It is a dye that strangles, that kills the yeast. And you can use that, say, 1 week a month if you have fungal issues in your nursery. And you basically dye it to the color of my shirt. That's why I wore this colored shirt, so that this would be the color you would dye the water. Gentian violet does not require prescription. It's a dye, and it's sold in Walmart, for example. I believe also in CVS and Walgreens drugstores. Next. Understand the idiosyncratic behaviors of some chicks. Macaws, if you keep them in a dark room and you suddenly flip on the lights, will flip on their backs. Leave a night light on. Talk to them before you come into the room. Let them know you are entering. These animals are very smart and quickly realize routine, even small chicks. When macaws flip on their backs, they can aspirate. Next. Vomiting during the first feeding in kikes as they feather out is quite common. All you do is feed less amount of food during the first feeding, and then the second feeding, you go back to normal. Next. Maintain strict hygiene. The greatest problem that I see in aviculture is poor hygiene. It is probably the #1 killer of chicks and the #1 problem of gram-negative bacteria in aviaries. The perception that hygiene is this is not correct. You need to change chicks constantly. You need to clean aviaries. The disturbance will not stop your birds from breeding. It will not kill them. On the contrary, they adapt to the hygiene and they survive. And they breed and they stay healthier and you have less bacterial issues. Next. You wash your hands. This particular aviary, the guy said, I don't understand why my babies are all dying from gram-negative bacteria. Well, look at the caretaker's fingers. He had dried feces from cleaning adult bird cages. Next. When planning to make young future breeders, rear them with their own kind, if not a similar species, allow them to become birds. There are two ways you can produce fabulous pets. One is you co-parent, you handle chicks that are being parent reared, or if you hand rear them, allow them to play, allow them to interact, allow them to become birds before they become pets. Next. And this nonsense claim that I hear all the time that, oh, hand-reared birds will never be successful parents, that's nonsense. Here are two different pairs of rose-breasted cockatoos with their chicks. Both of them were third-generation birds reared at my house. All I did when they were being hand-reared is I hand-reared them in groups, and I allowed them to fledge and interact as groups for 3 years. Then they were paired and used for breeding. Next. When you hand rear different species, understand that there are some diseases. Cockatiels, lovebirds, budgies, and ringnecks are toxic mares in an aviary. Many of them carry many diseases. If you hand rear them in a separate room, wash your hands, and have strict biosecurity. Next. Pseudomonas is a common problem. They get bent necks. These are signs that something is wrong in the aviary. Understand these issues and treat them. Don't believe that you can just medicate the bird and everything will be fine. Find the cause of why this is happening so it doesn't recur. Next. Clostridium is a very big problem, and I see it more and more worldwide. It started in the US. I now see it in Europe and Asia, across the world. Even if you maintain strict hygiene, this is one of those that can easily escape. When it does, and the vets will obviously lambaste me for this, but you can use metronidazole treated water to make the formula twice a day. And you may, if you have constant issues with Clostridium, you may want to use this as a prophylactic once a month. I don't normally recommend prophylactic medicine, but this is one of those cases that if you have a lot of issues, you need to treat, because if not, you will have high mortality. And it is a painful mortality because the chicks literally bleed in the intestines. Next. Here's another case. In an eclectus or in cockatoos, they literally turn white. Next. Polyoma is this bruising. Every single day during the breeding season of ringneck parakeets, I get messages, sir, my chicks have these hematomas. What medicine can I give them? This is a virus. This is very difficult to treat. There is a vaccine, but this is a virus. You should exclude, you should test all your ringnecks, all of your birds, all of your cockatiels, all of your lovebirds for polyoma and circle virus. Circle virus is beak and feather disease. Once you get these diseases into your aviaries, they're very difficult to eradicate. You need to be prepared to burn perches, burn nest boxes, change your air conditioning system. It will require tremendous work. It is much better to start off with clean stock than deal with a problem once it occurs. Next. And there's a vaccine, as I said, and it's available only in the US. It is a killed vaccine, so it's safe. It's not available worldwide. When you use it in kikes, you must use 1 shot of Baytril. If you don't, for whatever reason, you experience mortality. Next. Understand the disease risk and stay abreast of new findings. Here are 3 vets, Dr. Susan Clubb, Dr. Noisette Fernandez, and Dr. Stacy Gellis from Australia. So you've got 3 continents. You've got Noah from Spain, Stacy from Australia, Susan from the US. I consult with vets all the time. I want their opinion. Next. Beak and feather disease is a growing menace. When you see birds starting to turn yellow, when they lose their flight and tail feathers, When the beak begins to overgrow, this is a serious disease with no treatment. There are some vaccines being developed. There are some drugs that hold promise. Nothing is concrete yet. Test the birds and exclude them, because this is a virus that lives in dust. It'll live decades, and it will kill chick after chick after chick. The newer strains that are circulating even impact adult birds. I have seen it in birds that I knew from the 1970s that suddenly came in contact with infected ringneck parakeets, contracted it, and have died. Next. And in palm cockatoos, for example, it turns white feathers. There's no turning back. These birds are as good as dead. Next. A typical sign is these pinch feathers. It starts off with tail and flight feathers being gone. Then there's progressive loss. The bill overgrows, and then they die. Next. As I said, a vaccine is being developed. Nothing yet, but there is hope. There's hope that something will be done. This one was tried in Africa. I did some trials. It works on some species, not all. You need to use it very early on. So it's not a practical solution yet. Next. Bornavirus, or PDD, is another threat. It can lay dormant for years. I know of cases where single pet birds were suddenly moved from inside the house to the outside because the house was being remodeled, where the bird was moved from one room to another because the room was being painted, where a second bird was brought in. No one knows what triggers Bornavirus, PDD, but it is deadly. There is no simple cure. Yes, you can keep the birds alive with drugs, but we don't know how long they can survive on these drugs, and we don't know how long it will be before a vaccine or a solution is found. Next. Papillomas is another one, highly contagious. It's less common now. It was very common in macaws when they were imported from Guyana and Bolivia, and in Amazon parrots and hawkheads. When it happens, this one is highly contagious, but you can keep the birds alive, and you can even produce healthy chicks from them by feeding them hot peppers daily. I always recommend a cornbread that you add chili pepper powder to, and then you feed that to the chicks, to the adults. Once the eggs are laid, you take the eggs out, you disinfect them, and you can incubate healthy young, produce healthy young from those eggs. Next. This is how bad papillomas can get. And you see a bird that was brought to me in that stage. It was literally dumped at my doorstep. And several weeks later, after being given hot peppers, you see the same bird on the right. The problem is they've got to be kept on peppers their whole life. Next. You know, managing a collection is much more than feeding good food and cleaning. You need to be involved. This idea of putting food out, washing cages, and ignoring the birds, that doesn't apply. I work for a fuel company, and I look at my birds very early in the morning, and I look at them when I come home from work. And weekends I work. There are no breaks. There's no New Year's Day, no 4th of July. They need attention every day. Next. When you have pairs that don't produce eggs, culture them. Look for the cause. Simply being told, oh, well, I need to repair them. There's usually a reason why the birds are not producing fertile eggs. It's either because they're imprinted, or their diet is wrong, or they have a bacterial issue. Find the causes. Next. Antibiotics should only be used after sensitivities. These are culture plates, and you could see that that big circle tells me that would be the perfect antibiotic. The one that has no circle around it would be the wrong one. So you just don't grab something off the shelf and say, I'm going to use this. You find out what antibiotic will work. Once you establish historical data for your collection, then you could say, you know what, this antibiotic has worked most of the time. You take a culture before you use it. You consult with your vet. And then if your vet says, yes, go ahead and put the bird on it, you put the bird on it. Next. I thank you. I try to share as much information as I can. I have donated the rights to my books because I want aviculture to succeed. We have a lot of challenges from governments across the world that want us to not be able to keep pets. Aviculture boomed during COVID. We realized that keeping pets is mentally a healthy exercise. I encourage you to to follow aviculture, question the sources, and ask a lot of questions. When people challenge me, I never get angry. On the contrary, I say, you know what? I'm proud that they're challenging me with a question. That means they're seriously interested. When I go online and I see self-professed experts giving advice and no one questioning them, that's very sad, because that is a recipe for disaster. Chris, I don't know if you have any questions.
Yes, I do, Tony. So hopefully, and I know you're very busy, so I appreciate you doing this. So let me just get my view here. Show self view. All right, there we go. I just made sure everybody saw your beautiful face with the PowerPoint. A couple of things. So in U.S. aviculture right now, people are having challenges breeding African greys, which is probably one of the more popular parrots. Any tips or suggestions of
what we're seeing with the African gray is a recipe that we created for disaster. No one kept young. Everybody was selling babies. And these imprinted birds, everybody said, oh, we'll recycle them when somebody doesn't want a pet. Well, they're imprinted. They don't know how to behave with another bird. That is very dangerous. What's happened is that these birds don't know how to behave like a bird. They don't know how to mate, and they just don't breed. If you want to breed African greys by youngsters, spend the 3 to 4 to 5 years that it takes to maturing them and raise them.
So basically, patience that people don't have because they're able to sell them for a premium.
You know, I get messages weekly of somebody saying, I bought a pair of birds. I want them to start breeding. Look, if parrots were that easy to breed, they would be as cheap as chickens. They're not. They're expensive because they require patience, a good investment in food, time, energy, aviaries, etc. Recycling birds from the pet trade. Recycled macaws and Amazons are fine. You can recycle all the African greys you want. It's not going to mean that you're going to be able to breed them. Maybe 10% will adapt and learn to be birds. The rest just don't. The males don't know how to mate. The females will lay eggs, but the males have no clue how to mate. Buy youngsters if you can still buy them, raise them together, and wait the time. Just imagine the investment will be huge because each year that goes by, these old African greys that were wild imports pre-1992 stop breeding, and there's fewer and fewer chicks. That's why the prices have exploded. Imagine what's going to happen in 10 years when people continue to still sell the babies they breed. Nobody has amassed a breeding group and will be able to breach that problem.
So Tony, for us in agriculture in the U.S., because a lot of us want to grow it, want to bring new people to the fold. You mentioned 1978 as a watershed year. It seems like a lot of things happened in the U.S. in 1978. Why is you're always mentioned?
The 1970s and 1980s were Christmas. Species were flowing into aviculture at an unprecedented rate. Imports were allowed of wild birds. Clearly, that was not sustainable. But the law went from one extreme to the other. We should be allowed to import small numbers of birds without a consortium that some bureaucrat in Washington can decide whether they grant it or not. We should be able to import captive bred birds from captive breeding facilities.
Right.
We should be willing to accept that the birds will be genetically tested to make sure they are genuinely captive bred. And what they do is they test the parents, they test the offspring. Yes, they're genuinely offspring. They're not being laundered through a collection, and then allow us to import a set number of birds, 6 of each species, for example. 5. Europe allows 5 pet birds under the pet bird rule. So they go to some of these breeding facilities, they buy 5 pet birds, they get new blood, they can maintain the species.
Question on golden conures. Recently in US aviculture, we've seen a lot of people having challenges with golden conures.
They want to feed them a mushy formula. They need a chunky formula. On my YouTube page, I show them how to feed the chunky formula. If you try the chunky formula, you will not fail.
By the way, I saw you feed an African gray baby a chunky formula. And
yes.
I have to say, as someone that's never seen that before, it's jarring to watch.
Yes.
Obviously, you know what you're doing, but I'm just telling you from the perspective of you've only done smooth formula. You always, when you see it, you're like, oh my God. But then when, it's incredible to watch.
I had to spend a year going to a therapist because I fell from a tree looking at chicks and watching exactly that.
Wow. That's incredible.
The injury here taught me that feeding this liquefied formula was not the way to go.
Now, as far as diet, you mentioned pellets. Obviously, like you said, sunflower seeds, there's no sunflower in the rainforest where they're picking off the seeds or whatever. Sprout, the freeze-dried food, like all these things are now coming out. And you know what I'm talking about, where $2 for a bag of freeze-dried dandelion, whatever it is, I don't know. But
dandelions are cold temperature plants. How many parrots come from those cold areas? We need to understand that everything is unnatural. And these proponents of these crazy things say, oh, pellets are unnatural. Well, everything is unnatural. But pellets at least provide a balanced diet. Look, these people make these statements because they weren't in aviculture in the 1970s when we were losing birds left and right from dietary deficiencies. I get messages weekly from people in the Middle East who feed their African grays sunflower seeds because they believe that's the healthy diet, and watching these birds develop disease. It's really sad that these birds are dying because they're fed some of these diets. Feed pellets, feed vegetables. I feed 70% pellets, 30% vegetables. And depending on the species, I throw in some nuts. Periodically, I give some fruit for variety. That's a diet that's been proven. When they tell me, my diet of sprouts and pansies is much better, show me blood values. I can show you blood values of birds on pellets and vegetables. Show me blood values to show me that it's perfect. They don't do that.
And just for a note, if anyone doesn't know who you are, it's not just your collection. You work on some of the largest collections in the world. So you're one of those people I've seen case studies across.
I have bred more parrots than anybody else in the world, and I'm not saying that to toot my horn.
No, on top of that, you also are in front of the large. You were, director of Laurel Park. The amount of volume of data you have is incredible.
It's 50 years, and when I started, I was a kid. Nobody wanted to share any knowledge with me. The old timers, brushed me off, so I had to learn, and I fell down many times. I lost many birds by thinking that a parrot seed mix and apple and grapes and banana were the right diet. They're not.
You probably could answer this question. I'm seeing this on Facebook groups because there's thousands of people of, whatever the bird they're into. And these birds will pass away at 20 years old from a stroke or different weird things. Is that because people are giving them human food with high salt content or different things like that as they're eating?
I think a lot of it is because
the pet birds.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is some of these crazy diets. My grandmother had a double yellow-headed Amazon that died at 50. That bird never had sunflower seeds. It only ate vegetables from the table. And when we ate beans, it would eat beans. So basically, it would eat beans, it would eat vegetables, and periodically it would jump down and eat dog kibble. We're talking the 1970s.
Right.
We didn't know any better. I see many birds that are fed some of these obscene diets that live to be 20 and 30, and they have atherosclerosis
Right.
and blindness and all kinds of issues.
I'm sure people ask you about that because I haven't been doing this for as long as you have, but I'm getting asked like, hey, my bird mysteriously passed away, blah, blah, blah. And then you're thinking,
There was a book by Mrs. Emma Moon, and Emma Moon produced the first Lutino cockatiels. In fact, they were called moonbeams. And in her book, which was published in the 1970s, she said that the average lifespan of a cockatiel was 10 to 12 years, and that they would die of exhaustion after 12 years. They were dying because of poor diet. Today, cockatiels fed a good diet live to be 25 to 30 years.
yeah, it's incredible how much we've learned. So Tony, you travel the world and you see all the different places. The challenge we have now, and I've gone to a lot of young aviculturists, people are afraid to, because in the US, they're afraid of being targeted. Not from fellow aviculturists, but from just regulations, unfortunately.
Look, I never like to talk politics because I am apolitical. I worked for a congressman when I graduated from college, and I realized that politics are very dirty, both sides of the aisle. And the recent CITES meeting, the U.S. contingency that includes many AR groups were bitterly complaining that they couldn't take their huge delegations because USAID funds dried up. I'm very glad. They were taking 50, 60 people at taxpayer expense to lobby against animal keeping. Now they've got to pound the soil and get money, and they don't stay at five-star hotels and can have $1,000 meals. They've got to eat at McDonald's and stay at three-star hotels. Politics need to stay out of aviculture. As long as we follow the law and we provide good husbandry, we should be allowed to keep birds. I am hoping that the pendulum that swung way to the opposite end will somehow find its way in the middle of the road.
Right, and you've seen it from a level that very few people could understand.
Oh, I've sat at meetings, at CITES meetings, where I've been told better dead than bred. They would rather see a species become extinct than captive bred.
Is it because they could raise more money as the thing is going extinct? It doesn't make any
absolutely, man. It's big business. When you are an animal rights person, I want to make sure you don't have an air conditioner in your house. I want to make sure you don't wear leather shoes and you don't eat regular food, because you know what? Every time you eat food, some piece of land has been cleared to harvest fossil fuels. You're destroying the environment. So, let's do an introspective look before you start pointing fingers. As Heinz Thielman once said, never point one finger, because you have three fingers pointing back.
Now, because you traveled the world, I was very fortunate to go out to the Philippines and meet a really great man, TJ, and his little daughter, Maikos, who has Maikos Aviary. What's your view on aviculture in other parts of the world? Where do you